traffic, totaling 4041 uniform, departing 11, glider and
And I just remember sitting about 16,500 feet on the edge of the cloud deck, watching down, and it looked like essentially giant fists of wind coming down and just blowing 60 knots or something on the ground there, maybe gusts even higher through this microburst event that lifted up gliders. And I was too far away to see see any aircraft or anything, but I could see these big plumes of dust just billowing up from the desert floor.
This is Soaring the Sky, a glider pilot's podcast, coming to you from the Mid-Atlantic region here in the United States, and bringing you great soaring content from glider pilots all over the globe. We now join Chuck and our guest pilot.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Soaring community, for joining us. Welcome back to the podcast. We have another great show lined up for you today. One of the things we stress here on the pod is getting and keeping young people involved in our sport, as they are the future of soaring. Our guest, Zach, is a great example of this. Now, Zach is 23 years old, but has already accomplished so much in aviation and our sport. He is an aerospace engineer currently working for a company focused on unmanned aircraft. Zach learned how to fly gliders while attending Cal Poly. He also has had the opportunity to work on the Nixus project, the first general aviation project using a 28-meter glider wing using fly-by-wire. Zach will share with us more on this project as well as other soaring adventures that he has had. Later on the podcast, Chris Stevenson returns with a new listener logbook. Glad to have Chris back as he chats with some West Coast pilots about some recent winter flights they have had. Sergio, the soaring master, is also back with a brand new segment, and this one is called Should I Stay or Should I Go? All this and more right now on episode 107 of Soaring the Sky. Zach Yamauchi, welcome to Soaring the Sky. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Chuck. It's awesome to be here. I'm looking forward to this interview. I also want to say thanks for everything you're doing for the soaring community in terms of kind of connecting us with other pilots further distances away from each other. I've really enjoyed listening to this series that you've kept going. So, thanks for the good work.
You're absolutely welcome. You know, we have a great team here on the podcast, and we are having a blast doing this. But I'm looking forward to talking to you for sure. And, of course, I always like to ask in the beginning of the show, take us back to the beginning of your aviation story and how you got started and how you ended up in a sailplane.
So I'm a 23-year-old glider pilot. Currently live in San Luis Obispo, California, on the California Central Coast. But I'm one of those kids who is always fascinated by aviation and flight. And so grew up flying RC planes, kites as well. I had one glider flight about 10 years ago. Definitely piqued my interest. Knew flying would be something I definitely want to pursue, but at the time, being a kid, wasn't financially feasible to do so. So those dreams would have to wait till an unknown time. But anyways, I went to high school in Truckee, California. There's a glider port up there, but that was where I had my first flight of about 10 years ago. And then in 2016, I went down to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, where I currently live, to study aerospace engineering. And my freshman year down at Cal Poly, I was kind of looking for a club or some kind of extracurricular activity to supplement my engineering coursework. And so a couple months into school, I ran across a group called Occafleague Slow. And essentially what Occafleague Slow is, it was founded in about 2014, so a couple years before I got to Cal Poly. And what Occafleague, it's a German word that roughly translates to academic flying club. So in Germany, there's 14 of these clubs. And they work to bridge the gap between coursework, academic coursework, especially in engineering, and then practical hands-on experience. So Occafleagues are known in Germany for pushing the envelopes of sailplane engineering. They do a lot with gliders, flying and building them. In the U.S., we don't really have a model like that in our upper level education or higher education, and so it was the goal of the founders of this organization at Cal Poly to bring that Occafleague experience to a U.S. university. So first couple months at Cal Poly, ran across that club, went out to a local club, a glider club about an hour away from the university, where there was instruction available, club gliders for rent. Took an intro flight, was immediately hooked. The glider use and tow fees out there are incredibly affordable, given that it's a club with student rates to encourage younger people to get involved. After about a dozen or so flights, got the chance to solo, and about 6 months after that, got my license. The summer, it would have been summer of 2017. And then from there, it was trying to figure out opportunities to fly as much as possible. The club had a DG 100, which was available for members once they got their license. So I flew that a handful of times, and then after that, my second season of Soaring, I ran into an incredible opportunity, which I think we'll talk about more, but essentially being able to borrow a glider. One thing to add about Aquafleet, so it's an awesome organization, still around at Cal Poly. They've got, since my time there, actually, I guess since founding a couple of years before I joined, there's, I think total they've got around 30 glider students soloed, of college students soloed, and then about a dozen of those have gone on to get their license. So we've got a pretty strong stronghold of youth soaring pilots kind of coming out of Cal Poly in the Central California area. So currently still live in San Luis Obispo. I'm working as an aerospace engineer at a local small engineering company that works on unmanned aircraft.
So how did you break free of your home airport and start doing longer cross-country flights or landing out at other airports? Just kind of do it yourself, books, YouTube, or did you have mentors that actually flew with you on your task in a two-seater together, or did you do a buddy system?
Yeah, so I would say I've always been kind of on the aggressive side of the soaring and learning curve, just wanting to do as much as I can as quick as possible. Obviously keeping safety in mind, but really pushing for further, higher, longer, those types of things early on throughout my glider career, really. And so I would say in my third or fourth flight in that club, Club DG 100, I think I ended up about 25 miles away from the airport. We had a rule in that, so 19-1 to pattern to keep you within local flying, quote unquote local flying.
Right.
And so that was a booming day. Thermals up to 10,000 feet. 19-1 puts you about 25 miles away. So that's about as far as I ended up.
Right, nice.
And after that, I think they tightened down the rules a little more on taking that glider out. I think there was some required amount of landings you had to do before doing like true cross country, but technically I was still local, even though I was definitely pushing it. That really just came from, I guess, being ambitious about it. Still stayed within that 19-1 requirement, but I guess starting off, cross country wasn't something I was really afraid of. It was something that was really exciting to me, and especially when you're running those margins. We could talk about flying, what kind of margins to fly with later in the podcast, but running margins like 19-1, generally for half plus glide, I think on that glider is 38-1, so half of that. Generally, you're doing being pretty conservative. Obviously, given this specific circumstances for that, that can vary, but that's kind of how I first started getting into local cross country. And then once that Cirrus came along, really starting to branch out, keep flying cross country, keeping known fields and known strips in glide. Where I fly out of Avenal, it's actually I would have to say one of the probably best places to learn how to fly cross country. At airports at 800 feet, we've got a 4,400 foot ridge line about 6 miles from the airport. There's fields all around the airport in that California Central Valley. And then on good days, lift gets 8, 9, 10,000 feet up there. So generally speaking, lots of crop duster strips around, lots of fields to land in if you fall short of those, a pretty benign environment. So in terms of learning and getting out of kind of getting the first flights out of the local soaring area, it was just kind of jumping to different airports. Definitely had some good mentors through there. I know one of your early podcast guests, Thomas Greenhill, was a friend of mine. He started soaring a little bit before me, but we both kind of got through cross country and then eventually started competing around the same time as well. So Yeah, in the summers we were kind of able to bounce knowledge off each other, kind of debrief our flights, and then as well as a couple of other local glider pilots out of Avenal, also coming up in the ACA Fleet. Those pilots were learning cross country around the same time, and so yeah, just having a young group of pilots that are all kind of going with the same mission of learning to fly cross country, all at about a similar pace and then similar time frame. That really helped. Another bonus of being a young pilot is that the more experienced pilots are are just very apt to share that knowledge with you and help you out, give you pointers, help debrief flights, things like that. So really fortunate to have those opportunities. In terms of other materials for learning to fly cross country, I found books, specifically like Reichman's Cross Country Soaring, just getting a fundamental knowledge of gliders, polars, thermals, things like that. I know G. Dales has some excellent books, the Soaring engine for starting out, for learning the fundamentals and even into some kind of advanced techniques for flying and utilizing lift sources. Another thing that I still do to this day is a lot of OLC studying. OLC is a great resource for those of you guys don't know. Online contest. It's kind of a depository, at least in the US, I know, and I think in a lot of Europe, for glider pilots fly flights and then upload the flight traces to OLC. And so having all that knowledge kind of past flights and in almost in everywhere I've ever flown, having to look at other people who've flown that air, what they've done, how they get out, lift lines that they fly. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned from looking at OLC flights and looking at how the experts do it. In addition to that, just flying a lot and flying often keeps your skills sharp and then allows you to really progress a lot quicker and learn, kind of accumulate knowledge faster than when you spread flights further apart, when you tend to forget stuff and not be able to pick up on the specific cues that you do when you're flying often. And then, you asked about two-seaters, and I think, so fun fact here, didn't really fly cross-country two-seat at all until 2020, so a few years after I started flying cross-country. And that flight was actually in a Nixus glider, which we can talk about later. But so no two-seat training for me, so it can be done. You can get into cross-country successfully without flying two-seat. But I know for a lot of people that's really helpful.
Just Soaring, the makers of the Glider Sim Pro sailplane simulator cockpit, would like to congratulate German pilot Ben Fest for his recent victory in the first ever FAI-sanctioned aviation esports event in history, the Sailplane World Grand Prix, which Ben won after several days of exciting competition against some of the top Condor soaring pilots from around the world. If you are looking for a best-in-class dedicated sailplane simulator cockpit for Condor or Microsoft Flight Sim, look no further than the Just Soaring Glider Sim Pro. Check them out at justsoaring.com or at just.soaring on Instagram. I see you had a 816-kilometer flight in 2019, not long after you started flying cross-country. That's pretty crazy. Can you tell us about that flight?
Yeah, so that flight in particular was out of Inyokern. So Inyokern's a soaring site at the southern end of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It runs up California, the length of California, a little bit into Nevada. And it's home to the highest peak in the continental United States, Mount Whitney. And so that flight in particular was a wave flight. So the Sierra Nevada generates some of the strongest wave in the world. And most consistent for when the wave's going. Jim Payne flew a 2,900 kilometer and change flight out of there in that mountain range handful of years back. And so when the Sierra wave is going, it's like being on a highway. I mean, you get these lift bands that are wide, that are strong and consistent throughout the day. And so really that 800 kilometer flight early on my soaring career was not too difficult technically. It was more so of a challenge of staying warm and staying hydrated up at those altitudes. flying that wave. I think it was starting to become wintertime around then, but yeah, it was climb up through a little bit of rotor, get up into the wave. The wave's completely laminar, and push your nose down until you hit essentially flying most of that flight on the pushing up on the whatever the speed limit for the glider is in that rough air. So just keeping it below the rough air speed in case you hit turbulence, which wasn't really a factor in this, but kind of just bobbing and weaving your way in and out of the lift, because on the strong parts of that lift, you're hitting 2,500, 3,000 feet a minute. So staying out in front of those lift bars to essentially match your sink rate to the rising rate of the wave allows you to fly these incredibly long, fast flights without ever having to stop and turn. And so, yeah, it was pretty spectacular. It wasn't, I wouldn't say, a technically difficult flight, but of course, flying wave has a lot of risks associated with it, and can't recommend flying wave in the Sierra for people who don't have a full understanding of those risks associated with it. And I'm not a flight instructor, so I not necessarily feel comfortable with going into all of those things, but there's definitely resources online. There's a lot of books out there written by people who have learned a lot from mistakes to make flights like this and make flights like this safely in the Sierra.
Yeah, it's definitely another beast. You definitely want to be trained before you get into all that.
Yeah, and it's that was my first time out in the Inyo Kern wave, or at least out at Inyo Kern trying to fly wave. I think there's one or two times before that where I went out, drove. It's about 4 hours from my house, so not a short drive, but went out there, rigged the glider one time, another time just left in the box and said, you know what, this is not conditions I'm comfortable with. So really waiting for that perfect day to make a flight like this is really important, and not just falling in the trap of, I made the drive, so got to put the glider together, because a flight's what's the saying? It's better to wish that you're better that you're on the ground wishing you're in the air than in the air wishing you're on the ground.
Yeah, that's right.
Definitely. But it was a spectacular day. And glad I got to make that flight.
I was chatting with Mitch, our producer, who got his private rating in summer of 2020. He flies out of Crystal, just north of LA. Now, for him, the biggest thing is just needing to have a buddy system, and a buddy that has the time and energy to burn doing, retrieves and crewing for just recreational cross country. Forget about doing week-long regional races and stuff like that, but doing long local flights in the mountains is rewarding. But yeah, to really break loose from the home field, it takes a village kind of thing. Not only is one's own personal time hard to come by, but then it has to line up also with your buddies willing to be and capable crewing. There's a lot involved in that.
Yeah, so from what I understand for Crystal, so I've flown a lot of glider ports out of California, this side of the country, California, Nevada, but never flown out of Crystal. And from what I understand, there can sometimes be hard to get back there in the afternoons or evenings. So out and returns, or oftentimes from Crystal, I've heard it's just a guaranteed straight out. Could be wrong on that. I'd love to talk to Mitch more about this, probably one-on-one. To figure out if my perceptions are correct or not. But in terms of getting comfortable with flying outside of glide and starting to fly cross country, I'm fortunate enough to fly from Avenal, which is a site that's really conducive to out and return flights. It's lined up on a convergence line out between the Central Valley and the coast of California. And so, we're able to launch before noon and then get on that convergence line, go fly it, and come back. And there's always the cases when you're learning where something doesn't go right, you fall off the line, you get low and you need to land hopefully at an airport, or it could even be a field, but somewhere that is safe. And have to have a buddy come and get you. So the way I've kind of worked through this, because I don't have a dedicated crew hardly ever, and didn't really have that many dedicated crews starting soaring. First tip is always you got to be the first one in line to go pick someone up, because then they're in debt to you. So that's that's one of the tips is if someone else lands out, be the first one to pick them up, because they owe you maybe a steak dinner, but then also a retrieve when you need it. But then in
Right?
terms of that, yeah. In addition to that, just finding buddies. So oftentimes get to know the people in your glider club, get to know those people, have conversations with them, talk to your mentors. I'd be very surprised if someone who's willing to mentor you and give you advice is unwilling to pick you up if you landed out somewhere,
Yeah.
obviously within reason, but just having those things worked out before your flights puts the mind at ease in terms of making decisions, starting to push and things like that, knowing that, hey, if I go to this next cloud and it doesn't work out, someone will be there ready to get me, have your trailer hooked up, things like that, so that landing out is pretty much a non-event. And then in addition to that, there's always the ability to keep I think, at least for us at Avenal and then other places like Truckee, is if you don't make it back to Truckee or Avenal, if you land at a hard surface runway, the tow plane's available to come get you. So keep that in mind as an option too for an aero retrieve. But yeah, it's definitely, as one of my club members said it not too long ago. I think it was right after he soloed, but said that aviation, he didn't know aviation could be a team sport, and soaring shows that to be true. So yeah, it does take a village, but definitely good to get to know everybody and make friends and look out for each other as you're starting soaring.
Absolutely. And the soaring community definitely does a good job of that.
Yep.
We saw from your LinkedIn profile online that you used to build out and train people on flight sim gear. One of the projects, Mitch has been working on, besides helping out here at the podcast, building a dedicated glider sim for Condor. Do you think a properly set up Condor sim rig together with tablet and flight computer, running XC Soar or Top Hat or something, do you think that's helpful for pilots that want to learn how to fly and deal with their flight computer screens and swiping and on the off season?
Yeah, so Condor is an awesome tool we have as a glider community. I mean, overall gliders are aviation's small, generally aviation small, and then inside of that gliders are small. So it's pretty cool that we have a team essentially dedicated to making a simulator for us. So hats off to the Condor guys. You guys have some incredible software, and then also it's pretty cool to see what's happening with the hardware for the simulators, seeing that Just Soaring is putting out a pretty robust flight simulator. We also have I have experience with the Mach 0.1 simulator. Aquafleet actually had one donated to them a few years back, and that's gotten excellent use out of it amongst the college students. So I know that Condor has proven, at least from what I've seen, to be a very useful tool for a lot of aspects of flying. You asked about a past work experience I had, which was working at a flight sim company making simulators for powered GA aircraft. One of the things that was on the powered side of things, which was most useful, or the simulators were most useful for, was training pilots to fly instruments. And so with that, really, you use a simulator in that situation where the flying at that point is you're comfortable with the flying second nature, and you're really trying to get acquainted with the instruments, the way the avionics work in the airplane, shooting instrument approaches, things like that. And so in a glider, probably wouldn't be true 20, 30 years ago, but now our cockpits are kind of full of electronics, bells and whistles and all of that. And really, a lot of those electronics and features are critical to flying good flights and flying safely. And so being able to use Condor in a way that teaches you how to use your flight computer, your Varios, understanding how things behave in flight, but doing so on the ground is invaluable. I know that I personally fly with the UDI. I know that there's support for using UDI in Condor. I'm not sure how that is with LX and other flight computers, but if you're able to use, XD Soar as well is integratable with Top Hat, and so, is integratable with Condor. And so being able to use that in the flight simulator environment's a great way to get familiar with your flight computer, and something really, when you start flying cross country and getting away from your home airport, even flying locally, it's important to know how close you are to your glide margins, and other important parameters, winds, thermal strength, things like that in flight, and being able to access those, know what pages they're located on the flight computer and things like that. And so, yeah, definitely important to be able to, important to know how to use that piece of hardware and software to conduct safe flights. So being able to do that in Condor, yeah, I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that stuff all out of the way. Learn how to use it on the ground, so you're not doing it in the cockpit.
Sure.
Definitely don't want to be doing that. Aerox, the #1 in portable and engineered aviation oxygen systems, your source for FAA-approved oxygen masks and portable oxygen systems, and now introducing the Aerox Pro 2 Plus Flight Bag portable oxygen system. Small, lightweight, and simple to use, the Pro 2 Plus is perfect for the occasional user who wants the flexibility to access higher altitudes without worry about flying impaired. Now available at Aerox distributors and at Aerox.com. So remember, our friends at Aerox, engineered for aviators. Going back to your days at Cal Poly, and given that we've had the Perlin folks here on the podcast a couple times, can you tell us about the Nixus project you were a part of? Were there any interaction or relationships between that project and the Perlin project, or was it just Jim Payne taking some time to work with you guys? And also, maybe could you tell us about the glider itself?
Sure, yeah. So the Nixus project. So for those who haven't heard of this is a 28-meter fly-by-wire glider wing going on an Ash 30 fuselage with an aspect ratio of over 50-1. A lot of firsts in this aircraft. I believe it's like the first manned fly-by-wire general aviation aircraft. So fly-by-wire essentially means that traditionally in an aircraft, in gliders in particular, all of our controls are hooked up mechanically. So we have a mechanical linkage that goes from our stick between our legs and our pedals going back to the control surface. So when you move a stick, the control surface always moves the same amount for a given stick movement, and you can feel the control movement. You can feel the air moving, pushing up against the control. And it's a pretty robust, safe way of doing things. That's something that's been around since the early days of aviation, back to the Wright Flyer, everything being hooked up mechanically. Fly-by-wire is something that came along in the last, I would say, about 50 years or so, starting like a lot of that aviation technology does in the military with fighter jets, and essentially replacing that mechanical connection between the input device, so a stick or a yoke, replacing that mechanical connection from that to the flight control surface with an electronic means. So that's where the wire comes in. So essentially, those first fighter jets with fly-by-wire, you'd move the control stick. That would send an input to a computer. That computer would take in that input and then send an electronic output to an actuator on that control surface and move that control surface. In gliders, this has a lot of interesting things you can do with it. So on a big glider like Nixus, one of the actually reasons that fly-by-wire was chosen for this project is the wing is such high aspect ratio, meaning small thickness from forward to aft section of the wing to span, so wingtip to wingtip, that the wing ends up being really thin in the between the upper and lower surface on the wing. So not that much room for putting in mechanical control connections. So Nixus solves this problem by in the wing, at least on five of the 6, I believe, flaperon sections, using a servo and then connecting to a computer inside the fuselage with wires. It's still backed up. The outboard panels on the wing are still backed up redundantly with a mechanical control connection. So in the situation that everything stopped working, at least electronically, the glider would still have enough control authority to land safely. However, putting all of those servos and then also being able to control everything through a computer allows you to fine tune the control surfaces. So on a large open class glider like Nixus, comparable to what would be about like an Ash 30 or a Nimbus, JS1 even, you've got big mechanical mixers in the fuselage. So meaning they mix in the aileron and the flap movement. So on the wing, you roll into a turn, you have a flaps in a certain setting, and the flap and ailerons will move in conjunction, depending on what flap setting you have. That big mechanical mixer is something that is fixed. It's something that has to get designed really carefully to match the aerodynamic performance of the glider. When you switch all of that hardware out for software and for a computer, you could change a lot of things on the fly. For example, depending on what wing loading we're flying with, what airspeed we're flying with, what G loading we're flying with, the flaps can go to the most optimal position for the aerodynamics of the aircraft. So that's kind of what Nixus is. There's a lot of good content online if you want to look up more about that project and more curious about it. But my involvement of Nixus started in I believe 2018, around that time, while I was a student at Cal Poly studying under Dr. Paulo Iskold. Paulo Iskold is originally from Brazil, came to the U.S. to specifically work on this project. And around that time in 2018, who was a professor in Brazil, and essentially came to the U.S. to work on this project during a sabbatical. And not just any professor in Brazil. He's a multiple world record holder. Anakeem's another one of his projects. Also works on Red Bull Air Race. A pretty incredible guy to get to know, and then get to study under, and get to work on these cool projects with. So Paulo came to the, Cal Poly in about 2018, I believe, and with this project, maybe it was 2017. With it, he brought with him Nixus project, and while he was finishing this project, essentially brought it to Cal Poly. He had one last wing section to close up, and then had to do kind of the integration, the control integration, and a handful of other things on the aircraft before it was ready for flight testing. So about a year or so, a year and a half or so from the time he came to Cal Poly to its first flight. And so in order to do that, needed some help from no other than Akafleeg Slow got involved. And that's how I got introduced to the project. Something I spent a lot of time with during my time at Cal Poly. And starting with closing out the last section of the wing, up to integrating the flight controls, performing tests, ground vibrational tests, essentially hooking up hundreds of accelerometers to the wing, shaking it, and making sure that the models for flutter or other structural phenomena match up to the finite element, the computer models that the aircraft was designed around, and then onto the first flight. So it was pretty incredible experience to be a part of that first flight. This is where Jim Payne comes in. Jim Payne is the test pilot for the Nixus project, also the test pilot for, actually the chief pilot for Perlin project. And he came, I think first time I met him was in 2018 when he came to Cal Poly to give a talk on Perlin. And then as Akafleeg got more involved in Nixus, and as Nixus moved towards its first flight date, we worked pretty closely with Jim, obviously still with Paulo, and getting this glider ready for him. First flight happened at Castle Air Force Base, a big long runway up in Merced, California, old B-52 base. From that experience, eventually had the opportunity to fly with Jim and Nixus after graduating. I think it was important to Paulo that no active students flew in one of his airplanes that he made. But yeah, it was really special to actually be able to fly in an aircraft that I worked on, had the privilege of helping bring to life.
Wow, very nice. What an experience. So looking at some of your bio notes here, it looks like you're now the president of the Central California Soaring Association based in Avenal. Can you first describe for listeners where Avenal is located in California and the surrounding area? And on a good day in, say, July through September, if you wanted to do an out and return and not have a chase vehicle, what would be a good day, and where do you point from there, and what are the conditions along the way?
Yeah, so Avenal Avenal and the Central California Soaring Association. We're a club, 501c3 nonprofit, based in the California Central Valley on the western side of the Central Valley. We're about 2.5 hours from the Bay Area, south east, and then about probably 3 hours to the north of LA. What makes Avenal special and why it's kind of been preserved as a soaring site per se, is that it butts up against the mountain range called the San Benitos, which hook onto or which connect to a bunch of other mountain ranges in that area. But we get incredible convergence in spring, early spring through early summer, and then late summer through early fall, typically. And what that allows for some incredible flights out of that location. Flights that you can fly dozens, if not hundreds, even hundreds of miles without turning on that convergence line. So that convergence is formed when we got the warm inland valley air meeting the cooler coastal air. And then typically that line sets up not too far from the glider port. So on a good day, yeah, you could take a local tow, catch a local thermal at 1,500, 2,000 feet AGL, climb up to 6,000-7,000 feet, kind of punch your way into the convergence, and then hook your way up to cloud base, kind of ratchet sometimes is what we call it, ratchet our way up to cloud base there on the convergence line. And then from there, you kind of have the option of going north up towards the Bay Area or down south towards Santa Barbara and LA area. And yeah, on the good days on good days, we have flights that go as far north. I believe the furthest north we had this season, and I think in recent time, one of our very active members and one of my mentors, Morgan Hall, flew all the way up to Mount Diablo in the Bay Area. So about a 500K out and return from Avenal, and then down south all the way to Santa Barbara, LA area, even as far as on good days down to San Diego. Morgan also had a flight a few years back going straight out from Avenal to San Diego, and then took a launch out of San Diego the next day and flew back. So
Nice.
it allows access to a lot of that coastal convergence. And then something else unique about Avenal is a handful of days a year, you can actually hook up with the Sierras straight out of Avenal. So going south around the Central Valley, south, and then hooking to the east up the Tehachapi area, the Sierra foothills, and then into the Sierra proper. So yeah, Avenal, it's a small dirt strip out in the desert, out in the valley, but really has a lot of opportunities for some incredible flights. In terms of being able to do an out and return, yeah, so anything from a couple 100 kilometers to earlier this spring, I could talk about this a little bit later, but we had a couple of 800 and 900 K flights out of the area. Nice. Using that convergence, and then also hooking up with the Sierra. So there's definitely good opportunities for that, and being able to stay high in the convergence a lot of times doesn't warrant a chase vehicle, because at some point you just go as far south or as far north as you want to, and then turn around and ride that convergence all the way back.
Right. Nice. I know you've flown a bunch out of the Sierra also. Can you tell listeners about that and what makes this area so special?
So Sierra, as I talked about before, they're a big mountain range stretching between Southern California up to Northern California and spilling over into Nevada in parts. Incredible scenery, incredibly strong lift, and kind of a glider paradise, as I describe it, in this side of in this hemisphere of the Earth. So we've got a couple of sites that we can access them from. Truckee, Air Sailing up north, Minden are all kind of in that general vicinity up in the Tahoe, Reno area. And then on the southern side, Tehachapi and Inyokern are the other sites. And then Crystal to an extent too, that you can access the Sierra from. I've flown the Sierra primarily out of Truckee, and then Truckee and Inyokern just because it's close to the closest access point, or one of the closest access points to my house, living on the Central Coast. And then Truckee because my parents live there. Still got connections back there from high school. So it's a nice place to go to make a little soaring and then home vacation out of. And so Yeah, typical day in the Sierra, you're flying cloud base, 16, 18,000, sometimes even higher, obviously staying below 18, but ripping convergence lines, energy lines that line up with the peaks. And then on top of that, just being able to cover a lot of ground because you're staying up high, staying fast, taking good climbs. And it's pretty incredible soaring from probably about March until September.
Flying up in the mountainsides like Minden and Truckee, obviously you can be exposed to some pretty crazy weather, not only up in the air, but down on the ground, like taking off at those high altitudes on hot days or landing in super aggressive winds or gradient, all that. Can you maybe dial up a couple of interesting experiences you or maybe a flying buddy have had at those airports over the years?
Sure, Chuck. So, as spectacular as this Flying Sierra is, definitely comes with its fair share of hazards, weather particularly, but also terrain, high density altitudes, things like that. So, can't really recommend learning to fly cross country in the Sierra, but once you transition from another soaring site, getting the fundamentals down, and then having a good mentor or instructor to really prepare you for flying that. Maybe perhaps taking a two-seater flight, or flying team flying, lead and follow flying with someone who is familiar with the sites. That's generally probably the best way to get into flying in these conditions. But in terms of hazardous weather, a couple years back, I know there's a microburst at Minden that totaled some gliders there, and power planes as well. I was flying out of Truckee that day and essentially went down south, came back up north, and as the good days are there, it's typically the best days in the Sierra are the days where it's right on the edge of thunderstorming and it doesn't. And sometimes you fly in days that it does end up crossing that threshold and you do get thunderstorms. So obviously keeping your distance from those storms is important. I definitely did on this day, waiting to get back into Truckee. Kind of saw this cell blow up over Truckee and then move to the east over Minden. And I just remember sitting about 16,500 feet on the edge of the cloud deck, watching down, and it looked like essentially giant fists of wind coming down and just blowing. I want to say they had 50, 60 knots or something on the ground there, maybe gusts even higher through this microburst event that lifted up gliders. And I was too far away to see any aircraft or anything, but I could see these big plumes of dust just billowing up from the desert floor. Kind of surreal watching it there, and then waiting for the storm to dissipate, and then being able to take a really fat margin final glide back into Truckee. Under that dark sky.
Wow.
At that point, the thunderstorm had cleared, but there was still overcast at that point. So taking the final glide from pretty far out and then staying high on that was definitely a advisable strategy for a day like that.
Yeah. Crazy. Sometimes staying in the air and letting that wind down, is a good thing to do. It gets crazy and people are like, oh, I got to land. But you get the altitude and you can, it's good just to kind of wait it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you have the opportunity to, I'm a big fan of waiting things out. Sometimes you extend one of your legs, and hey, you might not make it back to where you took off, but you land at a close airport instead. The storms have dissipated, things like that. There's a lot of strategies you could utilize to make sure you're not landing in the thick of it. But yeah, it's not. I don't like it, but it's not out of the ordinary to land and either beat a storm in and have it rain a little bit or a lot on the ground once you're tying down your glider, or have to take a little bit of a final glide through a couple raindrops. But generally, yeah, best advice is to avoid those storms and avoid those situations. And fortunately, for the most part, I managed to do that. But yeah, definitely flying that area and those mountains definitely deserve a lot of respect. Weather can change in an instant. And can really ruin your day.
Absolutely. Our longtime sponsor of the show, the Soaring Academy, is engaged in nonprofit outreach work with local area veterans and also with young people for the STEM programs at their top-notch gliderport facility just outside of Los Angeles, nestled near the north side of the San Gabriel Mountains. They also have a fantastic flight school and are continuing to turn out great glider pilots every month. If you like to donate to their nonprofit initiatives or learn more about their flight school, go to soaringacademy.org or check them out on Instagram at Soaring Academy. Can you wind us back in time to a flight, maybe for whatever reason, magical, scary, character building, ego building, maybe record breaking? Just pick one of those flights that mainly really sticks out above the others in your mind, and just take listeners along for the ride that day and what made it special.
Yeah, so a flight and a day that stick out in my mind particularly were last spring at Avenal. Had one of my longest flights, almost my longest flight at that point. Ended up doing 957 kilometers out of Avenal in the convergence. It looked like an incredible day on the forecast leading up to it. So got a tow pilot lined up early. Knew it was going to be an early start to the day as well. So was planning for about a 10:30 or so launch. Actually ended up getting a tow from my buddy who I'd be flying with that day, Morgan Hall, who I mentioned earlier. He ended up towing me, and then the real tow pilot showed up, and then he got in his glider and took a tow right behind me.
Nice.
But yeah, that day was a kind of textbook convergence day, but everything to the extreme. So just starting really early, really strong convergence, really well marked, and ended up essentially what we call it's a yo-yo down the convergence. So I know in some circles it's kind of frowned upon to fly the same air twice in a flight. I know OLC rewards doing triangles and things like that. But this was a day that my ultimate goal was to do 1,000 kilometers. I thought it was possible, and I think had I had a little bit had a little bit different day or made a couple of different decisions, it definitely would have been possible. I fly a Discus A glider now, and in that glider, standard class 15 meters, so no flaps. Anything else higher performance, I think that wouldn't have been that much of a stretch to do. But I still think with the conditions and another day like that, it's still possible to do 1,000K out of Avenal in a standard class glider. And I think something important to keep in mind here out of Avenal and these sites, they're not high Sierra sites. So we're staying most of the time below 10,000 feet or so. So you don't get as much of a true airspeed advantage as you do soaring out in the desert. So kind of similar to what they do in Germany, where they just have to launch early and fly all day. So I ended up, I think, being close to 9 hours in the cockpit that day.
Wow.
Up and down the mountain, the coastal range, or the San Benitos and the other ranges close to the coast, doing that twice, and then coming in and landing. And yeah, that day I didn't land quite back to Avenal, landed about 5 miles short on, there's a paved strip there. That sometimes we use if we come up short on the final glide, which in this case we did, because yeah, the skies closed up, it got dark, and just a couple hundred feet below what I'd want for a final glide, and then put it in there. And yeah, on days like that, you definitely have your glider trailer ready to go, so your buddy can be there within 10 minutes if you land close enough. But yeah, landed there right before the rain, and then packed everything up and had a fun. I remember we went to go get tacos that night with everybody else who flew. Morgan, who I mentioned, also had a fantastic flight that day. He did a big triangle out towards the Sierra, staying on the foothill on the western slope of the Sierra, going up north and then crossing the valley at the end of the day back to Avenal. I think that ended up being like 800 or something kilometer triangle. So yeah, there's a couple days a year that we get it. Definitely some potential for some incredible flights, and then for even just a normal good convergence days, 500 kilometer flights are pretty easily had in that environment.
Zach, before we head into our lightning round questions, we usually like to ask pilots to spend some time talking about safety, and we'll leave this pretty open-ended, but in the interest of always trying to advance safety in this great sport of ours, what do you have to share with the community that might help prevent an incident or accident? And if you have any personal things that have happened to you or your buddies that would help us out and that we could all do better.
Yeah, so something, the big thing that comes to mind and for this question is flying with margins. So when you talk about margin, what kind of safety glide ratio are you using to your known land out spot? So yeah, as glider pilots, it's always always important to have a primary land out planned, and then even if that doesn't work, potentially a backup landing area too. And so when we're flying cross country, we're still flying local to essentially flying local to landable site at all times. Shouldn't really find yourself in a situation where you get low and then you're scrambling for options of what to do. So in order to know what you have as options, I think it's really important to understand what kind of margins you should be flying with, and also safety McCready. I think that's safety McCready is probably a conversation for another podcast or another topic. I know the Soaring Master has some videos on that. Chess in the Air as well has a blog on that if you want to get into that more and don't understand it. But really, fundamentally, what it is knowing what glide ratio you can depend on given some conditions to make it to a field. So as I mentioned earlier, starting to fly the DG back in the early days, giving myself half best glide, so 18-1 back to the field. Keeping that glide ratio was kind of a hard fixed number. After getting out of that DG, flying the Cirrus a handful of hours, I tended to push that number up, so getting into the mid to high 20s, and then even up to 30, depending on the conditions. Looking back on that definitely got into situations where you hit even just a little bit of a sink or some of a headwind, where you eat up those margins really quick. So understanding that, flying. What I've told people now that I've had more experience with soaring is that flying when you're stressed is not fun. So in order to not be stressed, it's best to know that you always have a land out and you're always going to make that. And so flying with an adequate margin allows you to do that, and flying with essentially margins on margins. So just because you start flying more, get more comfortable with cross country soaring, important to keep those margins in mind and not erode those margins. So that, when you hit bad weather, you hit sink, you have a lot of essentially a buffer onto to eat into, and you'll always make it back to a good landing spot. Prevents landouts, prevents having to find a miracle thermal, things like that, and then just makes flying a much more enjoyable experience when you're not stressed about the potential of a unplanned or big major inconvenient land out for a place that you wouldn't want to land.
Absolutely. Some great advice. Thank you, Zach. And last but not least, before we head into the lightning round questions, we always give our guest pilots a chance to give a shout out to those that have been helpful in the pursuit of their soaring journey, whether that's family, friends, instructors, or other mentors. Zach, it's your chance.
Sure. So going back to how I got into soaring with Aquafleet Slow, so all of those who made that club and that organization possible, specifically, want to thank one of our founders of that group, Frank Owen, who was a Cal Poly professor in mechanical engineering department. He had some relationships with some of the German Aquafleet, so actually send one of the founding Aquafleet members, Jen Bowman, helped organize a trip with her to Germany to really see those Aquafleets firsthand. Unfortunately, we lost Frank earlier this year to cancer, so he's no longer with us, but definitely grateful for what he did for making Aquafleet and then my entry into soaring possible. Another one of our big influential members, mentors, instructors for Aquafleet, Don Flynn, offered really affordable instruction for our Aquafleet members, was there to teach ground school, to help with flight simulators, help shuttle students back and forth to the field, always super positive, awesome member of Aquafleet and then Central California Soaring Association. And that helped really bring a lot of juniors into the sport. In addition to that, some of my mentors, Morgan Hall, who I fly out of Avenal, give him a shout out. And then David Greenhill, Peter Dean also helped me along the way, especially getting into mountain soaring. And then Paulo, Dr. Iskold, and then Sergio, who was instrumental in getting the Nixus project, making it happen. Both of them, couldn't thank them enough for the opportunity to work on such an incredible project during my undergraduate degree. Also wanted to thank my parents. So I don't come from an aviation family, but getting into soaring, and them just kind of seeing all the bad parts of general aviation. Really just grateful for their patience and understanding while I pursue my passion, even though if it is something that sometimes they worry about me in the air. Haven't scared them too bad yet, but appreciate all their support with the sport. I'd also like to thank Garrett and the crew down at Sky Sailing. So Garrett Willett down at Sky Sailing in San Diego was one of the ones who really made my journey with the Standard Cirrus a couple of years back possible. The gentleman who donated it to Garrett to find a junior to fly. And so without him, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. And then further on, a couple of years back, Garrett loaned me some shop space to work on my personal glider after returning the Cirrus to do a refinish on that. So that was a big help in my soaring journey so far. So really appreciate that, Garrett.
So our soaring lightning round, are you ready for this? All right, if you could only pick one, what glider port or region would be at the tippy top of your bucket list of places to go soaring, and why?
Let's see. Definitely want to fly in Europe. I see some incredible flights in the Alps. That would be probably number one at this point. Although I think before I can fully take advantage of those conditions, there's still so much more to explore in the U.S. and semi-locally. But yeah, that's definitely on the bucket list.
What's harder for lower hour pilots to master? Getting into and staying in wave, or staying in convergent lines for long distances?
I would say definitely convergence. Wave is kind of binary. Is either you're in lift or you're in lift or in sync. And sometimes working weak wave gets a little bit more difficult, but convergence, at least for me, learning to fly wave was a lot more straightforward and aligned a lot better with my textbook understanding of it, compared to convergence, where there's all these little intricacies. And I mean, I think it takes years, if not decades, to really master flying convergence. And especially because there's so much variety in convergence in terms of even at a particular site, terrain, weather, all of these things that influence convergence, and different days in the same site can yield completely different flying conditions.
What's the highest altitude you've ever been in a glider, and where was it?
That was 26,500 feet, I think, out of Inyokern, California.
Nice. P-tube, P-bag, diaper, or pee out the window?
That's a good one. My personal glider, P-tube for me. When I'm flying in other gliders, yeah, bring bags. Don't really know what their accommodations are always, so just better to keep something that's portable, essentially.
Yeah. If you could fly your glider at only one bank angle other than level, what would it be?
Probably 1 degree. Just go as straight as possible, as far as possible, and then maybe switch to 1 degree the other side. Is that allowed?
Sure. What's your favorite type of lift, all things equal? Thermal, wave, ridge, or convergence?
See, it's in the summers, probably the answer would be wave, and then in the winter it'd be missing thermals. So it depends on the season, but generally speaking, convergence is also just a really neat puzzle to try and solve. And so probably just to pick one, probably just convergence, especially because it's just so prevalent in everywhere that I soar.
What's the strangest or most spectacular thing you've ever seen in a glider cockpit? And we don't judge here, so you can say it was a UFO. It's okay.
Okay, so I would actually, it's funny you bring up UFO. I would say that I did see a UFO. It was some kind of aircraft that I could not identify what it was. A flying wing shaped thing out in the desert, kind of around Mojave, Edwards Air Force Base, up pretty high there. Wasn't sure if it kind of had a B-21 shape, but I know that aircraft's not flying, so potentially like a, shoot, I forget the designation of it, RQ-180 maybe, drone, one of the classified drones, but definitely something that was not anything that was public knowledge at that point, I think. So that has to take the cake for the most interesting thing I've seen in terms of aircraft out outside my window.
If you had to pick one thing for lower hour pilots trying to learn how to thermal more efficiently, and effectively, what would be your advice to them?
Yeah, I would say bank harder than you think you need to. A lot of times the lift is a lot stronger in the center of the thermal, and um, one of the big things I see with newer lower hour pilots coming out of Schweitzer's is like keeping a pretty shallow bank angle. And typically, yeah, you get in the core of the thermal, find it first, and then crank that bank over 45 to 50 degrees or so, which um, initially typically feels pretty tight, but generally speaking, there's a lot of good lift in that center of the thermal. It just depends on the thermal too, though. Um, Kind of have to get that sense for the width of thermal. Sometimes, yeah, you get away with 30, 40 degrees, but other times it's definitely, and I say most of the time, definitely prudent to increase that bank angle tighter.
Money no object, and you could only spend it on a glider. What dream glider would you buy, and what do you like about it?
Hmm. You know, is what I've been looking at recently, especially after last World Gliding Championships, is how well the Diana twos are still doing. That's I think about a 20-year-old design already, and still winning top of the world. So Diana 3, I know those things are flying out and around and more conventional, but still keeping a lot of the conventional wing layout, but more Diana airfoils and some of that Diana magic there. And so potentially a Diana 3, I know those are available in FES. That's what I'd say right now. I know there's a lot of super ships out there that would outperform that, some open class gliders, but the convenience of having a 15 or 18 meter glider and the practicality of that would probably make me lean towards some kind of modern glider, modern 18 meter glider, probably Diana 3.
Wings and Wheels has been serving the soaring and sport aviation community for over 30 years. They hands down have the largest and most comprehensive inventory of sailplane and soaring supplies in North America, and they ship globally. Nearly everything you'll find on their site is in stock and ready for same-day shipping. Wings and Wheels is the exclusive American representative for HPH sailplanes. Be sure to check out the Twin Shark, their latest launch. The team has thousands of hours of flying experience in gliders and airplanes, staffed by Adam, Kelly, Julie, and Sean. A friendly voice will answer when you call or email them. Check them out at wingsandwheels.com. You have a gently sloping uphill field you can land out in, but your flight computer is showing a brisk 15-knot tailwind, and the only other field that looks viable is your land out becomes imminent. Well, that field is sloping about the same gradient, but downhill, and has a 15-knot headwind. Which one would you pick, and why?
So in this case, I'd pick the uphill slope with the tailwind. I'll be coming in faster, but um, one of the problems with landing a downhill one is as you come to slow down, even with a headwind, you and what was the headwind you were saying? 15 knots?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so 15 knots, that might not be enough to actually make you come to a stop before you overshoot the field, just because your sink rate might match the field angle, and then you might have some additional problems after you overfly the field that you're intending on landing on. So yeah, I'll take the uphill with the tailwind and just come in fast. Hopefully it's not too bad of a uphill.
Your favorite glider port accommodations: tent, RV, local flea bag motel.
For me, it depends. So, fortunate enough to borrow an RV for nationals last year, and that was awesome accommodations. But typically, when
Oh,
it's just
nice.
an overnight thing, out at Inyokern or out other places, camp in my car, camp in the glider. I've done spent plenty of nights in the glider clubhouses. So, yeah,
Right?
try to avoid the tent because it's just an extra step to set up. But I know that's always an option. But yeah, car or sleeping on the couch in the glider port.
What and where was your lowest or most memorable save from a land out?
Uh, it was a time I was at Shafter, out in the Central Valley. Friend called his name's Josh Nur has a Pawnee and a bunch of antique gliders out there as well as his LaBelle, and we were getting some tows out there because we didn't have tows available at the time at our club in Avenal, and I was planning on doing some flights for currency, and was first flight was just going to be a rope break just to get a couple of takeoffs and landings in. So got off the tow plane probably about I guess more pattern, but low pattern. Got off about 1,000 AGL, and then came in, turned downwind, or got on downwind. And as soon as I got on downwind, essentially got into a 4 or 5 knot climb and actually climbed out with that. Definitely not advising to thermal out of the pattern. I know a lot of glider ports and operations that's not allowed, not just frowned upon, but not allowed. But in this case, there's no traffic around. And I was in a position where if that turn didn't work out, I was one turn away from just coming into final turn for landing. So yeah, don't condone thermaling low or anything like that. But in this situation, it was available and worked out.
What's your favorite flight computer, irrespective of what you have currently in your glider?
Yeah.
Just what would your ideal flight computer, and what do you like about it over others?
Yes. So my glider right now, I've got a UDI, Navitor UDI 2, and then I've got a just this new last season I put a butterfly Vario in. So the combination of those two is what I rely on most for getting all my information. UDI is great because it's transferable between gliders. You can take it home, you can use it on Condor, and it's affordable as well. You get one of those, typically find them secondhand for under or around $300, and I think they're only 100 or more, 100 or so more if you get them new. So the UDI is great. I like that. Also, being able to, in the contest setting, be able to take it out of my glider and put the task in while we're at the task meeting, and then head out to the glider and pop it in. And then the butterfly Vario / flight computer is amazing because of the wind readout it gets you. So especially where I'm flying a lot of convergence. I've never flown with a flight computer that has the types of winds that it has on it. Types of winds where essentially you could fly by a thermal and see the arrow move on it as you fly past the thermal. So it's about a 10-second wind average on it. So can't speak highly enough about that instrument. Definitely a game changer. But the combo of those two is serving me really well in my glider.
If you had to rank the various weather products available to cross-country pilots, which one would you overall rank the best?
Yeah, so definitely my go-tos are our local RASP, OG RASP, call it the OG RASP at Avenal. That's been around for, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe even longer, definitely longer than I've been in Soaring. For our local area, they've got one gentleman up in Northern California, Bart, maintains ours. And then he also maintains one for the Sierras. I know Val, fellow glider pilot out in the Bay Area, also has a RASP we use for the coastal range and Sierras as well. So we've got those couple of RASPs. Those are great for, I just feel like those have really good calibration towards that local area. But SkySight is, shout out to Matthew. Thank you for getting that done and continuing to improve that product, because it's invaluable for and game changing for what we've had in the last couple of years. New features seems like all the time. Great convergence marking when we're flying in the blue, and then awesome for wave integration too. And then the fact you can load that weather onto a flight computer is great.
Okay, so Zach, you're at the gas station and someone comes up to you and asks what's in the trailer. You say A, a mini drag racing car, B, a submarine, C, a large model rocket, or D, just be boring and tell them it's a glider.
Oh, it depends if I'm in a rush or not. If I'm in a hurry to get home or go soaring, yeah, I'll give them a smart answer and tell them a submarine or a rocket or something like that and get on my way. But if I got time, if I'm feeling chatty, and I mean, you never know who you're going to meet at a gas station. You tell them, oh, yeah, it's an airplane or a glider. And, I'm towing it out to either go flying or come from a flight, and chat a little while the gas tank's filling up. It just kind of depends on the situation.
So you get back to your pad after a long day of cross-country soaring in the summer. What's the first thing you do? Take a shower, drink a cold beer or other beverage of choice, look at your flight track and start making notes and what you did wrong, or flop on the bed and take a nap while still wearing your bucket hat?
So in the past, it used to be the first thing I get home, upload to OLC. Last season, I upgraded my FLARM to the FLARM Fusion, so that happens almost as soon as I land through Bluetooth on my phone. So that's no longer a thing. Most of the time, it's jumping in the shower, especially flying out of Avenal. We fly out at at a dirt strip. It's quite dusty out there, so. After a good day of flying and a 5, 6, 7 hours in the cockpit, you end up sweaty with a layer of dust covering you, and it's almost like a grime that you want to get off. And so it's definitely nice to get home and then clean up right away, and then don't worry about all the stuff to unload and get back ready for the next adventure.
Well, Zach, thanks for doing the lightning round. It's always fun. And thank you for being on the podcast. I've really enjoyed your adventures, and I know the listeners have enjoyed it. So, yeah, thanks again for taking your time and doing that.
Chuck, my pleasure. It's awesome being on here. Awesome being a guest on this podcast that I've listened to so many episodes of, and hope to talk to you sometime soon in the future. Maybe talk about some flights from next season or something.
Absolutely. I'm always famous for bugging my guest again, so you can count on it.
Great. Well, thank you.
All right, we're here at Antelope Valley Soaring. It is Saturday, December 4th, and we're with Christian Lignan and Maciek Makowacki, who's both very excellent longtime pilots here, both at Aviation and other places. And amazingly, they had a flight of 55 minutes on December 4th. So, Christian, can you tell us something about this flight, what made it so unique for December 4th?
What's interesting is, you always go flying in the winter thinking the air is dead, there's no condition. It's just,
right.
We enjoy the camaraderie, the scenery, and being up in the air. And some thermals pop up, not very strong, but still good enough to challenge and keep a 0 or +1, maybe +200 feet a minute. And, a flight which was supposed to last maybe 15 minutes.
Right.
Ends up like 55 minutes, almost an hour. So it's great. It's wonderful for 4th of December.
4th of December, absolutely. And it's also, I've been told and heard that it's the good winter pilots who can work those 1 and 2 knot thermals that, makes you even better summer pilot. So were you primarily piloting, Maciek, or were you taking turns?
Yeah, we switched. I did takeoff and landing. So I take full responsibility.
Yeah. It was good landing, good takeoff.
No, but so we basically flew, half and half, thermaling wise. Joint effort.
Yeah.
Joint effort, plus.
But I wanted to comment earlier. So, because it's winter flying, one should come with different expectations, right?
Sure.
And if your expectations adjust to the season, you will be rewarded. Like today, I came with an expectation of a sled ride,
right.
And we got this. So I'm like as stoked as I would be summer, like a 4-hour, 15,000 feet flight.
Right.
It's super nice. You keep your skills up, and you had a good time. Perfect weather. Like what can you ask else for?
Yeah. What else can you ask for? I mean, an hour is like 4 hours in the summer, right?
Yeah.
The goal is to fly all year round, and it's a bonus flying 55 minutes. Plus, we share the experience.
Yeah.
You can see our thermaling's technique and appreciate someone else landing, takeoff, all these part of the flight. Every part of the flight is something we can learn from another pilot.
Yeah.
And the cherry on the cake was flying in the same thermal with Lee, right? So
exactly. There you
we
go.
were like wingtip to wingtip. It was awesome. Like that. That alone was worth it,
Absolutely.
And wintertime, super nice.
Yeah, well, we're fortunate to be able to do that here in the Mojave, so that was awesome. Well, thanks for talking to me, and have a safe trip home. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, Sergio from Soaring Master here. Today we're gonna talk about the decision to commit ourselves to a task after takeoff. The decision to go cross-country must be taken before leaving the gliding field, and it always causes some tension with that big question running in our minds. Should I stay or should I go? But There are ways to better decide this. After launch, once you have climbed, fly towards the opposite direction of your first leg up to the gliding cone limit of your gliding field. And once there, head back to the field in the direction of the first leg up to the opposite gliding cone limit. This cone crossing is a good navigation probe. A sailplane can easily cover 10 or 15 nautical miles of representative weather by doing this, and while you fly, assess whether thermal average matches your forecast and analyze if thermal spacing is good enough for your glider performance. If conditions are satisfactory, you can proceed directly and depart. If not, head back to your gliding field and wait for the conditions to improve while you analyze the possible reasons for this difference between current weather and forecast. Is there any delayed heating occurring, an inversion? Was the forecast too optimistic? Assess if your original task still is achievable or not, if you need to reduce the task length, or if it's better just to make a local flight. The important thing is to have an emotionally detached attitude towards the flight conditions ahead and your flight goal. If the big picture seems to remain constant, most certainly the first leg conditions will be much alike. With experience, the decision to go will become less stressful because you will not be guessing, but taking decisions based on sound judgment. I hope that this tip makes this type of decision a lot easier, guys. And just a quick note, the Soaring Master course will open its first class in December. The Soaring Master course is a training method in the form of an online course that helps pilots better identify their gaps and provides in-depth lectures and proposed training sessions to help them improve in a faster way. For more info, subscribe at soaringmaster.com or follow me on Instagram at soaringmaster.
Thank you, Sergio, for another great Soaring Master segment. I also want to thank our on-the-road reporter, Christopher Stevenson, for bringing us another short chat with some of our friends there in the Mojave. Zach Yamauchi, thank you for sharing us your story today as well. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and happy soaring.
If you would like to say hi and let us know where you are enjoying the podcast, we would love to hear from you. If you are a glider pilot and want to share your aviation journey, contact us at chuck@soaringthesky.com or send us a message on our website at soaringthesky.com and Chuck will get in touch with you. We hope you join us next time for another soaring adventure here on Soaring the Sky, a Glider Pilots podcast. Soaring the Sky is written and produced by Chuck Fulton, co-producer Mitch Thompson. Original music for the podcast was written and produced by Kim Spangler. Graphic design for the podcast was created by Zachary Fulton. Voiceover work was done by Michelle Perez.